and I'd play my cards too early, where I would escalate it from 0 to 10 too early with the threat, hoping that that would solve the problem.
Yeah.
But really, the moment you can't execute on any form of threat, well, then you lose all credibility, and where do you go from there? Giles, good to see you again, my man.
Good to be back.
Yeah, so we were having a great chat before this about obviously a few things.
Yeah.
So I thought what we could do today is just talk a little bit about some more personal stuff.
Okay, I'd like to.
Ideally, kind of get an idea of the man behind the brand, I guess you could say.
Okay.
Behind Pay For. So you and I talked quite a few times about your love for Israel, and
Yep.
I think you were in the military there at some point. Is that right?
Yeah, I did actually end up in boot camp in the IDF at age 18.
Okay. What does that stand for? By the idea?
Israeli Defense Forces.
Right. Okay.
So this was when I was just interested in learning more about my heritage.
Yeah. Sure.
And so I, went back to the source.
Of course, as you do.
Learned Hebrew.
Yeah.
And I was on a kibbutz in Israel, and,
Right.
the IDF were coming round, because they were obviously trying to recruit, young Jewish people,
Sure.
from overseas.
Sure.
With the idea of getting into emigrate and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
So, but none of that was really of interest to me. I was 18, and it was an opportunity to do something really interesting.
Yeah.
And I always rise to challenges.
Of
So
course,
I guess
yeah,
that's
yeah.
the thing about me.
So for those who might not know, because obviously we're in London, and you have a huge Jewish community and a long tradition, and so if you're in London, you kind of pick up on a few things. I think maybe a few people that are watching this maybe don't know what a kibbutz is, for example, and so maybe you can walk us through. You were obviously living in London,
Yeah.
and then at some point you decided to go to Israel. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So maybe you can kind of walk us through that.
Sure. So I don't think it's necessarily something that all Jewish kids are potentially going to do.
No, of
some
course.
extreme
Yeah,
thing
yeah,
of going to end up in the Israeli army. But I think in my case, just because my mom could.
I mean, that would make it a very big army.
Yeah, it would. I mean, I think it's just not. It's quite daunting.
Yeah,
so
of course.
probably for some people who are maybe not up for that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in my case, because I was probably searching. Well, not probably. I was searching for my own identity in terms of who I was, who I am,
Sure.
and this was something I wanted to explore. One parent wasn't Jewish. My mum converted, so my dad's Jewish,
Right.
and that makes me Jewish because I was born obviously after my mum converted. But nevertheless, there was still something I was searching for inside to find out who I am, what
Sure.
my identity is, and I think. Being a Jew in London is one thing. Going to Israel is a whole different story.
Yeah.
Obviously they're very different. Like as Jackie Mason, the comedian, said, when Jews go to Israel, they turn into Puerto Ricans.
No offense to Puerto Ricans at all.
No
but,
offense to Puerto Ricans or Israelis for that matter, but I think it's like an interesting little anecdote,
Sure.
which is amusing from the point of view of, it's those types of people who ended up starting that country who, were up for the challenge.
Yeah, of course.
The challenges that lay there.
Yeah. So you went there when you were about 16.
First went there actually when I was 15.
15?
Yeah, and I turned 16 while I was,
right.
so I did like this little Jewish tour.
Okay.
Saw all the sites, got a sense of what the country was about. The whole idea is really like, it's one of these, they do like birthright tours there now. The Jewish kids can basically get what Israel is. You spend a bit of time on a kibbutz, a bit of time here, go to the Wailing Wall, go to the Sea of Galilee, see things like
Great.
that.
And so the kibbutz, what's a kibbutz then?
A kibbutz is a communal, a commune.
Yeah,
Okay? So
okay.
where basically it's a sort of socialist ideal. Israel
Right,
was
okay.
founded on these sorts of socialist politics.
Yeah.
Some kibbutzes predate the
foundation of Israel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in 1948. So some of these kibbutzes also became quite wealthy, and did quite well and became quite established.
Yeah.
Today they're still going, and they're really hard to get into now because like lots of people.
So that's quite brave, because so obviously you're 15, you go there for the first time.
Yeah.
And then at 16 years old, you decide to actually commit to going and living in one of these communes. Did you have any relatives that were there with you, or?
So what it was that first year of being 15, I literally only just did a summer tour there, and then came home after 4 weeks. But it really like blew my mind. It was like it was like a revelation, you know. Just no pun intended, of course, you know. But it really was like that for me. It was like, wow, you know, this is like I really like this place, really like the people. This really talks to me, you know. Then so I was really interested to go back again when I was 16. Went back to a similar youth tour. Brought a few mates with me from London, Jewish mates. You know, we did it again. Spent a bit more extra time there, and then I had the bug properly. And I was thinking, next year I'm going back. You know, I'll leave school. You know, I'll be. You know, I'm going to go back there. I want to learn Hebrew. So I ended up going back to this kibbutz. They had this ulpan program where you actually, ulpan means studio in Hebrew. So basically you're studying Hebrew part of the time and working on kibbutz for your keep kind of the rest of the time.
Yeah, of course. Well, you got to do your part.
You've got to do your part.
Yeah.
And so that was when I'd made this commitment to go. And so I was 17, gone out to Israel, spent 7 months on a kibbutz. During that 7-month period while I was on the kibbutz, the IDF were doing the rounds, and that's when they turned up and went, right, who fancies, you know, their chances?
And obviously you put your hand up.
There were a few of us, you know, and you know, like, you know, like I'm up for that. And
so then you went into the military.
Yeah.
And how long was the stint in the military then?
So it was 3 months.
Okay.
It was a 3-month course. It's called Marva, and Marva in Hebrew means crossing over.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So I think the whole idea is, you know, like you know, new immigrants or you know, people that are interested in basically emigrating to Israel. It's this crossing over period where you can understand what it's like to be in the Israeli army.
Sure.
So obviously at age 18, if I'd made that decision to emigrate at that time, I'd absolutely would have ended up in Lebanon. You know.
Oh wow.
That's where I would have ended up.
Yeah, of course, because that was where the conflict was.
Yeah, it's where they were sending people. You know,
So do you feel that there are some key things that you picked up while you were in the military that you obviously use for pay for?
I mean, it's hard to put my finger on specific things, obviously, because some time has passed. But what I ultimately would say is that it made me as a person, you know. So I did go in a boy and came out a man 100% for sure. Like the stuff, you know, I think that the challenge of passing that time in boot camp in the IDF does, you know, really slap the stupidness out of you completely.
It was funny because I at one point I was supposed to go into the military.
Really?
Well, there's two things. So one, I was supposed to go into military academy when I was about 14 years old.
Really?
My parents definitely wanted to slap the stupid out of me.
I don't know where I came up with that line.
No, that's a great saying. Yeah. This is totally true, though. You know, and metaphorically speaking, of course.
Yeah.
You know? And then, so I didn't do that, but I ended up going to another boarding school. But then after that, I got called because in Italy you had to do compulsory. It was compulsory up until 1985.
Well, how
I was the first year in which it wasn't mandatory. And so you could be excused. Actually, I was the last year. Sorry. So I was the last year, and the only reason why I was
about to say you were really lucky, but not quite.
Yeah, but then basically, if you were going to university, you could be exempt.
Right.
And so I only needed to be exempt for 1 more year, and then because of that, I didn't end up going. But I kind of regret it. I have to be honest with you. I feel like...
Would you have done boot camp then? I guess you probably would have.
You know, even to this day, sometimes I kind of think, man, I'd be well up for doing a bit of boot camp.
It's a good laugh. I mean, in many ways, look, I was an 18-year-old kid with an M16.
I know.
My own M16.
That's pretty cool.
It doesn't get better than that. No. You know, if you're an 18-year-old boy from London, you know, I mean, obviously there were a lot of other parts of it that were super unfun. You know, like not as fun. You know, at all. But just this aspect of military where you have an opportunity to shoot submachine guns, M16s, Galils, Uzis. You know, the Uzi is an iconic. Become this iconic.
Yeah, of course. Isn't it? The Uzi is quite fast, right? So the
Uzi is short, so you can keep it like this.
Exactly.
So it's good for urban conflicts, like
you
know, for example, in Lebanon or places like that, where a lot of the fighting is taking place in cities.
Yeah. I mean, I love how we've called complete gun sidetrack on this.
We have a bit, but I suppose there is, you know,
for sure,
some parallels.
For sure. And so are there any specific things that you think, I mean, one of the obvious thing I would think is certainly a struggle, because one of the things that I've learned in working with you, in obviously getting to know debt collection and general services that Pay4 provides, is that like most things, at the end of the day, it's about overcoming a challenge.
Yeah.
And I think, well, from my personal experience, but perhaps you can speak a little bit more. I mean, definitely I would say that any stint in the military is definitely about overcoming challenges,
Definitely.
right? So
I think experiences in the military, obviously not just in Israel, but any military, anywhere, at the end of the day, it's going to teach you things like, it's going to teach you, first of all, a lot about yourself.
For sure.
And it's going to answer a lot of questions you may have about yourself when you're on the spot, and what would you ultimately do in a really
when the proverbial shit hits the fan.
when the proverbial shit hits the fan. That's really it. So and I think these are a lot of valuable things that a person can learn about themselves. And armed with that knowledge, it's useful in life, whatever you do.
Sure.
But I also think things like doing what you say you're going to do are really important, because the army is really all about teamwork. Talking about the Israeli army, it's absolutely about that. It's like what you do is going to affect the next person. I mean, they're obviously training a lot of the population to be in the army. So most of the population, apart from obviously kids and old people, are experiencing the army. So because it's such a small country and such a small population, so therefore lots of people are going in there. And relying on each other as a team.
Well, you have to.
So I think that's one of the things it taught me, apart from challenges and not being, backwards in, coming forward sort of thing and confronting things. But it also taught me about, the importance of doing what you say you're going to do.
Yeah. So be a man of your word.
Yeah.
Yeah. So getting back to Pay For just for a minute. I mean, one of the key things that I think people would be interested to know, I'm certainly interested to know, in your experience, have you found that there are a certain set of skills that are absolutely necessary in order to be good at this job, in order to be good at collecting money or, collecting money essentially? Yeah,
I was thinking about this on the way in actually, because I think anyone can really kind of go like hell for leather and just sort of be aggressive or demanding or make threats. It's easy to do that, isn't it? I think that really the key thing about it is maybe not doing that and actually realizing that it's not necessarily the threat of what you do. It's actually the threat of what you say you're going to do. And actually, I can directly take that out of my experience of the IDF, or military training and things like Sun Tzu, where it's because once you've actually carried out the threat, the person
then you've got nothing else. Yeah,
actually
I agree,
that
100%.
bad, and now I'm good, and I've passed that kind of.
It's funny. I used to make that mistake all the time when I first started the business.
Really?
Yeah, because I was relatively young. I mean, I'd had a few different businesses, but nothing that was kind of like this. And I would play my cards too early a lot of times, right? So I'd be in a situation where there was some form of dispute or some form of confrontation, whether it was a client or supplier or whatever not, and I'd play my cards too early, where I would escalate it from 0 to 10 too early with the threat, hoping that would solve the problem.
Yeah.
But really, the moment you can't execute on any form of threat, well, then you lose all credibility, and where do you go from there?
You lose all credibility, and I also think you potentially can miss opportunities to resolve something or actually arrive at that end goal that you wanted to arrive at, i.e. reclaim the debt. I mean, this happened to me kind of from a recent experience I had, where I was in a meeting with the legal affairs head of a business that owes a client of mine money, and they actually have a judgment against them that in that territory. And I was talking to this person about it, and I did sort of actually, I'll just admit to it, I mean, I'm only human, but I did kind of lose control for a moment. And I think I used words to the effect of, we'll pursue this until the bitter end. It was something too emotionally loaded. And I thought back and I ultimately regretted it in saying it, because it actually, if anything, it reduced the opportunity of coming to a settlement agreement with this person. Because I've now attacked him personally, and he's now going to kind of think in the back of his mind, F you. Who do you think, will then...
Yeah, one thing that I also found, perhaps you can speak about a little bit, is if you're ever in a situation of where there's a dispute or there's a confrontation, the first one is to understand if both parties actually understand each other, or whether we're just talking over each other.
That's an interesting one.
So I would definitely say that's, in my personal experience, that's always been an issue. So whenever I approach a situation, the first thing I ask is, can you please explain what your understanding of the situation is?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Right? And then the first thing it does is it very clearly shows that I'm not trying to be confrontational with that person.
Yeah.
And the second thing that it does, it gives that person to vent but at the same time explain their position so that I fully comprehend not only what's happened, but where they're coming from also emotionally. And then I can hopefully address it because I have all the information in front of me rather than attacking and making a bunch of assumptions that might be wrong.
Yep.
Yeah. And then once we've done that, then generally it's, you catch a lot more bees with honey.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
I think if there's anything I've learned from watching how you do business, that's absolutely one of the things. Obviously, pay for.
Which is very odd because I never used to be like that.
No, I know.
I know. It kind of just happened over time. I got to be honest. I think a lot of it had to do with having kids.
It's a great leveler, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, that'll hit some. It'll slap the stupid out of you for
slap
sure.
the stupid. That will definitely slap the stupid out of you.
Yeah, for sure.
And I just think it's one of those things where you have to learn from experience. You have to kind of learn the hard way.
Yeah.
Wasn't it Steve Jobs who said, like, anyone can make something complex? That's easy.
Oh, for sure.
Any idiot can make something complex.
Absolutely.
How do you make it simple? And I think it's a little bit like that in a way, isn't it? Anyone can just fly off the handle and try and intimidate people. But then, and also after you've done that, you can't put the toothpaste back in the toothpaste tube, can you?
Yeah, no, you can't.
Once it's out, once these words are out of your mouth,
That's
you'll
it.
instantly regret it.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things I was kind of thinking about this morning was, generally speaking, we're talking, the debt collection services applies to all sorts of businesses, right? The small, medium, even large businesses.
Yeah.
Ultimately use it and certainly pay for it, can do a great job for that. But I guess my question was, do you find that there's any difference between people that are just starting off in terms of their business or people that have been established as far as when they engage with you or the way that they handle their own debt?
Yeah, I suppose you do in a way, because you can obviously get people that make the same old rookie errors that we've all probably made when we start off in business, of course, but I think you can also get companies who owe other companies money, and they're starting off in business, but you can tell like they're always going to be like that. They're never going to pay anyone, and they're always going to be a bit shady. And it's obviously to do with Bitcoin, or it's a company that's disappearing.
Sure.
And now, lo and behold, another company is going to So that's just the way they want to conduct themselves. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people out like that.
And the other thing is, what a lot of people don't realize, and we both had experiences with this, is whether or not you work for a large established business or whether you work for a small business. At the end of the day, you're still a person.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of people, with a few exceptions, will let emotion sometimes get the best of them in terms of these situations, which are by definition somewhat confrontational.
Yeah.
Right. And I've generally found that, I remember even one time we were dealing with a client, and I think he was the attorney general for some country in the Middle East.
I remember the one.
Yeah. And this person completely lost their cool.
Yeah, they did, didn't they? Yeah.
And it became...
You didn't need storm off out of the call and stuff, didn't he?
Yeah. And, and it just goes to show that, this was the most senior legal representative of a nation.
He was the head of legal affairs, wasn't he, in the ministry of
That's right.
that country, which we won't mention.
That's right. And he lost his cool.
Yeah.
Completely unnecessarily, completely uncalled for.
Yeah.
Which just goes to show that, generally speaking, if you're too close to the sun, right, when you're too close to the situation, that's where very often it's actually beneficial to have someone who's a third party, say, for example, like Payfor.
Absolutely.
Because you remove that emotional component, because you're just dealing with it in a way where it's just about business and it's just about solving the problem at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Right. I have no grudge. I'm not interested in the intricate details of this.
Yeah.
I just want to get this sorted out.
Yeah, and that's when you have an opportunity to sort of say, well, look, here's the position as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the details of the case. And you just only stay on the facts, the factual side of it.
Yeah. Which is interesting. One of the things that I actually use quite often is I'll use the having to justify it to a third party. So let's say I'm in a situation where there's a dispute.
Yeah.
Right? What will happen is that person will be like, yeah, but I want this and I want that, or I feel like I'm owed this or I'm owed that. And what I'll do is I'll say, I completely understand where you're coming from and I sympathize with you. However, my challenge would be that if I were to explain this to somebody else who's not been involved in the case, and they were to look at it objectively, I'm sure you can appreciate that they would not perhaps agree with you, because objectively speaking, that's what this says on the contract.
Yeah.
And so it's not like I'm saying this and I'm creating confrontation. I'm deflecting the confrontation, but I'm still making the point.
And you're sort of kind of blaming a third party in a way.
Correct.
And then you're kind of resetting the expectations of the other side. That seems like it's one of those almost like negotiation tactics, kind of the CIA like hostage negotiators.
Much more simple ever. Yeah, but I would definitely say, and that's one of the things that, I mean, I've obviously learned a lot working with you and working with Pay4.
Thanks.
But I would definitely say that there's so many different ways that you are not necessarily thinking about when you're in a situation where you have a debt, because the reality is, well, you're most likely going to have some form of emotional connection to that element, to that thing, because reality is maybe you've delivered the services, you delivered the product, and you feel like maybe you got screwed over, or maybe you're owed something and it's not given to you, which is going to make you frustrated, make you angry.
Yeah, absolutely. But, and then when you've become angry and you've already said something, usually what tends to happen is, the person storms out of the meeting like that guy, or if they didn't, one way or another, at some point, they're probably going to end up having to apologize for that. Yes. Then what did you gain by that? You're apologizing to the person you're trying to extract a concession out of? How's that working, It's a bit like, the way I kind of tend to compare it is almost like a football game where the footballers are dribbling the ball back and forth. They're not going to the goal yet to try and shoot, because they know that they need more men down the end, so they the ball's being passed around and they're looking for that opportunity to kind of make their big play, and so before, if you're going to do that, obviously don't make the big play until you're absolutely ready to do it, because obviously after that you can't. The ball goes past the goalie and it's done, or it goes in the goal and you score a goal, but you have to. Good point.
Yeah. Just kind of see where the opportunity arises by playing maybe the different departments, the different people, looking at the different
and
things.
Do it endlessly, kind of thing,
Yeah, that's good. So what do you think are the main responsibilities of a debt collector?
Well, I'd say there's different responsibilities. There's obviously a responsibility that we have to our client to conduct ourselves in a specific way. There's also, I think, responsibilities we have to the debtor as well to treat them fairly, But I'd say one of the main responsibilities that comes to mind would be, for example, when you're in that dialogue, often by email, make sure that you line up your get your ducks in a row in terms of this may not get resolved before litigation happens. So what with litigation being something that might happen in the future, say things which are going to strengthen that position at a later date. For example, offer to make concessions, offer to compromise, offer to settle, offer solutions. Otherwise, later on down the line, when a judge is looking at it and trying to make his mind up about things like costs, he's actually going to be able to say, well, this guy actually was offering a solution far earlier on that you could have taken. You could have saved us all this hassle of coming to court, not to mention the cost of it. And because you didn't, respond favourably to what he was suggesting, his compromise, I'm going to load the costs on you. And this is something, obviously I'm not a lawyer, but this is something I've heard a lot from lawyers. And they often say,
of course. And this kind of goes back to the original point that we were making earlier, which is, if you're too emotionally wrapped up in that situation, you can't play three-dimensional chess, because you're so focused in that particular instance that you might not necessarily be thinking, well, this isn't just about who's right or wrong. This is about playing it with a view that it might eventually escalate where it does need to go to trial, it does need to go to court, or maybe it just needs to be presented where there's lawyers actually getting involved. And once both lawyers on each respective party get involved and they look at what's happened, if you played your cards right, like you said, by maybe offering a reasonable solution halfway through that made perfect sense and was a fair solution for everybody, anyone else looking at it might go, well, you wasted everyone's time by pursuing this further. You could have resolved it there and then, and that might mean that it actually gets attributed in your favor.
Yeah, and this is something that we do a lot in terms of the debt collection part before the legal collection side comes up, as mentioned before.
Great. So, we talk a lot about what do you do when things go wrong and you eventually have the debt. I think one of the things that I would love to hear a little bit more is, do you have any advice for customers to avoid getting in a position where they actually have the bad debt in the first place?
Yeah, I think it's probably all about due diligence, really.
Okay.
On the one hand, know who you're sort of getting into bed with, as it were, business-wise.
Yeah.
That would be one thing. I suppose that's probably an obvious thing. So maybe a less obvious thing that would come up would be, for example, just really beef up your late payment penalties and make sure you've got those right.
Yeah.
And again, the king of all, deciding factors being the jurisdiction. Because if you have the jurisdiction wrong, for example, it's in a territory where that jurisdiction is not really respecting international law, or judgments from other territories.
Or it's also not practical for you to have to defend something if it's tens of thousands of miles away. That's not realistic. If you have to defend something in a jurisdiction that is just physically very far away from where you are, that's also going to be very...
I see this a lot where companies have agreed carte blanche to whatever their usually bigger company is requiring them to agree to. Here's our contract, you want to work with us, sign it, And the jurisdiction, lo and behold, is in... No, if the small little company could be in Ukraine or Europe somewhere, and the big company's in the States, and in America, the law is working differently in different states, and it can be really expensive to litigate people there. So, they're keeping everything in their favor.
Yeah,
and I'd say the jurisdiction is one of the number one factors that would change everything.
Yeah. I mean, in my personal experience with TBD Media, I mean, I would definitely say this is more of it's a combination of kind of just business advice and sales advice, but I would definitely say that the best way to not be subject to a one-way negotiation is to diversify your options. So if you are putting all your eggs in one basket, then you are much more likely to just agree to whatever they're going to say, because that's your only source of revenue, that's your only source of business.
Yeah.
But if you actually have a diversified revenue stream in terms of you have a lot of clients or you have different departments, but you're diversifying where your money's coming from for your business, then you're not going to be so dependent on that one particular deal actually going through, and then you actually might be in a position where you say, you know what, no, we're not going to agree to those terms because those are not favorable and they don't work. And you can afford to do that because you have a diversified business.
Yeah.
And you're not just completely relying on them.
And I think maybe you've discovered that kind of retrospectively and realized that to be the case.
Yes.
It's a hard thing.
Yeah, we learned it the hard way.
Yeah. To get right, from the very beginning.
That's it.
I think what people have probably got to do is say, all right, what's my business model? And then how best is this business model going to thrive and survive in specific markets where I'm selling it, If you're trying to sell that business model in Germany, what does the German law say about what you're offering to do for clients, If it says, well, that's going to need to be always in the client's favor, then maybe you need to think about having the jurisdiction in Germany,
Yeah. Okay, so I was curious. We were talking a little bit about obviously debt and clients and everything. What are some of the excuses that you hear most of the time, or what are some of the early signs that you generally get? Let's say, for example, you have, because on the last podcast we talked a little bit about when's the right time to actually commission things to a debt collector, right?
Yeah.
And you said, well, literally the moment that it is overdue.
Yeah.
Send it straight away, or straight away get somebody on the case.
Yeah.
And I couldn't agree with you more, because straight away it shows intent and determination in not letting it slide.
Yeah.
But are there any sort of other telltale signs, or what are some of the common excuses that you generally hear that really make your ears perk up and go, okay, we've got one here. We've got somebody who might be a bit...
What you got to do is you got to think like airport security.
Right, okay.
You got to think about consistency.
Right.
Okay, so are people consistent?
I always get stopped at the airport, by the way.
Yeah, well, especially if you're traveling to Tel Aviv of all places, you're going to be talking a lot to security.
Yeah.
What they look for is they're looking for inconsistent signs. So who's the person traveling with?
Right.
Or or the police, for example, when they ask a question and then they ask it again later on to see if they get the same reply. So I'd say as soon as you see any inconsistent signs from a client that owes you money, beware, from that point onwards.
So specific to, obviously this.
Yeah.
What could be some of those inconsistencies? Can you give me some examples of what that might look like?
Yeah. So they're supposed to pay 30 days end of month.
Yeah.
And the first month they pay the 30 days. The month after they pay 40 days. So this is basically testing your limits. And then after that they pay 60 days, or they pay 80% of what they owe. Now they pay 70%, and then the next month, so they always like, oh yeah, no, we'll make that up on the next, So those are inconsistencies. So the minute that's happening is the exact moment that you need to like rethink what is wrong in the situation, and really start to think about what you're going to do to kind of combat that.
I would imagine also lack of communication and lack of coming back to you when you're trying to engage them and onboard them.
Yeah, lack of communication, lying, or just basically making stuff up that just doesn't seem believable.
Yeah.
So I'd say like all of these things are basically falling under.
And what do you think is a good, what should people do when they see those? Because obviously the reality is it's a bit of a gray zone, right? Because you're picking up on something, but you don't have, firm evidence, shall we say, to really go and say, well, you're clearly trying to pull a fast one here.
Yeah.
You kind of sense it, and you kind of know it might be happening. You have an intuition about it. What are some of the ways that you can handle it where it wouldn't actually escalate the situation unnecessarily, but you're still managing it and handling it?
I think it's always going to come back down to leverage every single time.
Right.
So what do you have over them? Or what do they have over you? So, for example, if you're that company that didn't bother negotiating the agreement, just signed whatever, and now you're stuck in that agreement, and you don't really have any leverage. So you don't have any leverage. So I'd say in that situation, obviously you've signed that agreement, so you're kind of in the situation you're in. But what I'd say to companies like that is rethink your client agreement, negotiate better next time, and learn a lesson from that. What they're going to do in terms of being owed money from the situation they're in is something else. But people have to learn one way or another that you can't just sign up to any agreement, and that you've got to really think, like, what's in the agreement? How's it going to affect you? What's my leverage if it all goes wrong? Or what's my plan B if it all goes wrong? So that's kind of the thing I would say to them.
Sure.
For the people
So basically, you would have, let's say you have a situation where someone is not engaging with you, right? So you're on the onboarding or procurement phase, right? Which is between them signing the contract to you now getting all the necessary information, whether it's for a purchase order or whether it's simply to have the details inserted into their database or whatever it might be, right?
Yeah.
And they're not responsive during that phase. What you're basically saying is make sure you have a tight contract where you have some leverage, where you can go, well, we're kind of behind the 8 ball here in terms of timing. I really need you, because if not, don't forget the contract says X, Y, Z.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those also where people have got to play it instinctively. Because I think a lot of the times you kind of feel like, is this person being straight with me or not? I kind of like this person. They came across well when I first spoke to them. You kind of feel like, you don't know what it is, a gut instinct about trusting them. I'm going to go with, and plus the agreement. So I think you have to pick out the different factors that at play, where it's like a contractual reason, it's the relationship you have with them, it's maybe also how established that company is.
Yeah.
Are they, a small company from nowhere that could have messed people around in the past? Yeah. Are they a big company that probably are less likely to have a good reputation, etc.? I think all of these things together, and you have to kind of weigh it up in your own mind.
Sure.
I think if you rely on any single one of them on their own, for example, it can also lead you down that road of you're going to go back to them and basically just upset them by saying something like, well, my contract says this, that, and the other, so you bloody well do as you're told, so.
Well, one thing I was thinking about when you were saying that is, obviously I'm originally Italian, you're from London, but you obviously have a huge connection with Israel, like we said earlier.
Yeah.
And I think culturally, both of us are somewhat used to confrontation.
Yeah.
Because it's in our family, in terms of that's how we were brought up, and culturally, it's
culturally for sure.
We're used to.
Yeah.
We're used to having discussions and arguments where people are loud and they're
gesticulating.
Gesticulating and very very open about their opinions and very forthcoming. And I think that perhaps one of the things that I've actually just in this conversation noticed is maybe that's one of the benefits. And one of the reasons why, we're both good at this is because a lot of times people are just not comfortable in having confrontations. And they're really incapable of staying in that middle lane where they're not calm, but they haven't lost, their mind. And they're somewhere in the middle where it's clear that something's not okay, but the way that they're communicating it is not necessarily aggressive, it's just firm. Yeah, and because you and I are just used to it, and it's just part of what we do.
Yeah,
that you're then able to have a conversation with the client where you're in that lane where you're going, look, we obviously have a problem here. We need to deal with it. But you're not doing it in a way where both people then just end up the phone because they're shouting over each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And I also think, just from a cultural point of view, it's really useful to have some sense of what the culture is of the country, from
sure.
the people that you're talking to. If you're talking to some cultures, everything's up front. In the Middle East, it tends to be like, a massive shouting match, and then at the end of it, it's like really calm.
And then it's okay. Now I like you.
Yeah, now I like you. You can come and have dinner with my family, and it's crazy. It's like no different to how it was probably done hundreds of thousands of years, or hundreds and thousands of years ago in the shuk, in the market,
for sure.
where it was marketplace dynamics, and what's really changed since then?
No, I know. In a funny kind of way, I think you're similar to this. I kind of enjoy that because I can see how not really badly intentioned it is, and it's fun. It's just a little bit of fun. But to the vast majority of people, I would imagine, especially in Anglo-Saxon cultures, where it's very much the opposite. You have to be polite and you have to do things. I can imagine that being like, oh my God. Actually, I don't know if it was with you or I think it was with my lawyer who said he originally brought up in Canada. And then he used to say to me that when Italians originally immigrated into Canada, when there was a huge surge of population, he said that the police would always get involved and have to remove them.
Really?
But they were just having arguments in the streets.
Yeah.
And people wouldn't know, and they think that they were having a fight, and then they would call the police, and the police would have to remove them just because they're talking about whether they're going to get cheese or milk or ham or whatever it is.
Yeah,
it's
so similar to Israelis.
Yeah.
When you hear people, chatting in Hebrew and stuff, and they just sound like they're having an argument.
Yeah,
they're just talking about where they're going to go and have a drink of cappuccino.
Yeah,
it's hilarious.
Yeah. So, listen, we had a great time today.
Yeah, really fun.
I wanted to kind of wrap it up with one last question. It was kind of a technical question.
Yeah.
What is a letter of demand?
Well, a letter of demand is usually used in a process where you're going to issue legal proceedings, and prior to actually issuing those legal proceedings, the what do you call it? The step which is going to be before that has to be the sending of a letter of demand. That's according to some kind of legal process, which is understood to be like part of the legal law, where you send a letter of demand to warn that person. And usually you have some like practice direction wrapped up in that as well, of when and how and the exact timing of it, and offering to do arbitration or some form of dispute.
So it's basically, it does a couple of things. The first thing is it very clearly sets out what your demands are to that client, so that there's no confusion. But what I suspect it also does is signals the intention that if this is not resolved, you are clearly looking to pursue this legally, because you've almost embarked in terms of this legal journey, this is kind of step one of that journey, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what it is. And it's also conforming to what a court is going to expect you to have done before you brought this matter to them. If you did not do that, you cannot issue the legal proceedings because you actually didn't do that.
Of course.
You also risk it getting thrown out of court because you didn't do that. So at least under English law anyway.
Yeah, that's good to know. So, and does a lawyer have to send a letter of demand, or can a client do it?
I think that's a great question. So I'd say anyone can actually do it, and you can find the formats online of how exactly what needs to be in there. I think the bottom line of what you're really doing is you are setting out the story of why it's a debt, but you're actually saying what you want done about it. So that can be you either pay me or let's resolve it and just negotiate a settlement. Otherwise, it's legal proceedings. So when you go to court, you'll be doing the same thing. You'll be issuing your legal proceedings, and you'll be asking the court, "Look, this is my problem, and here's what I want you to do about it." So that's what the court will say. What do you want us to do?
Of course. That's very interesting. And you're saying most people can just find a template online, just follow the template, and that will certainly signal to whoever owes you money that you're serious about it.
For the UK, I'd say, just go on the UK government website and you can actually find all the details there. Or if you go to Money Claim Online and you want to issue a small claim, then it will also tell you like pretty
About
much
the
the
letter of
same
demand
thing.
and everything. Yeah.
Obviously, if it's a bigger claim, it's probably better just coming from a lawyer.
That's great.
And then the lawyer's going to handle all the practice direction and all of that stuff around it.
Well, that's fantastic. Listen, I think next time, now that you mentioned the claim, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about claims.
Yeah.
And how people can do that. I mean, obviously, we can talk about the UK.
Yep.
First and foremost, and then maybe we can kind of expand it. But I'd love to go into that. But
That would be a good one.
listen, thanks so much. Always good to sit down with you.
Thanks
man.
a lot as well.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers, man.
Cheers, guys.